The 37th America's Cup starts in just 4 months' time. Welcome, I'm Helen Fretter, editor of Yachting World, and in the countdown to this year's running of the oldest sporting trophy in the world, we're going to be taking a closer look at each of the AC75s as the teams launch their race boats ahead of competition in Barcelona this summer. To help us understand what we're looking at, I'm very pleased to introduce Thomas Tison. Thomas is a naval architect and yacht designer who has worked on 4 Cup cycles, from the pivotal 2007 Cup in Valencia, with Artemis Racing in Bermuda, and with 2 British teams, including the current Challengers of Record. In particular, he's worked on foil, wing, and structural design for Cup teams, and has a really in-depth understanding of the AC75 class and how the teams are working to accelerate their performance with this, the second generation of the foiling monohulls. So, Thomas, thank you so much for joining us. What are we expecting to see this year?
I think what we expect to see is a second generation boat. So in the previous America's Cup, Team New Zealand won and came up with this new concept. And what we expect to see in this America's Cup is a refinement of this concept as every team tried to gain an edge to win the America's Cup.
And of course, what we saw with Alinghi, Red Bull Racing, was that they were first to unveil their boat. They showed their AC75 at an evening launch party. So we all got a first chance to see the hull, but not much else because the foils were concealed, which they're allowed to do until the first launch. And of course, it didn't have a rig or anything like that. And then the boat actually touched water for the first time yesterday, which was April the 16th. And it was formally christened. It's a big moment for the whole team. The rig stepped, and then it went into some initial tow testing. So we've seen it in daylight a little bit now. We've seen it with the rig up. And so from what you've seen so far, what do you make of the Alinghi design?
I think we can see that it's been influenced by Team New Zealand's first boat. So it has the same sort of architecture with the mainsail in between 2 cockpit pods, and with the bustle extending all the way to the hull surface. But where we can see some interesting aspects is in the aerodynamics, the detailing of the geometry. So whereas Team New Zealand had pods which were extending all the way to the back and sort of tapering down to the main geometry, Alinghi have sort of shortened the pods and changed the direction of the flow. So instead of the flow going up and down, it's now going more around it. So it creates, for now, a geometry that we haven't seen in any other America's Cup boat. So I find this is quite interesting. And you can also see on this picture how they are dealing with the geometry of the hull in way of the jib. So everything forward of the jib basically is just the introduction of the flow into the boat, and doesn't really have a structural aspect or so on. And you either then have 2 options. One is to extend the boat to sort of do an end plate, or on the contrary, try and get the flow into the jib in a smoother way. And I think that's the way they have approached it now. We have to remember also that Alinghi have teamed up with Red Bull Racing. Internally, they are very, very good fluid dynamicists. And so you can see that they have gone into the details and the refinements of the design.
So from the outside, obviously, the most standout feature from that view is that cutaway of the top sides.
Yeah.
What is that achieving? Is that a weight save? Is that a rule gain? What do they win by that shape?
I think the aim really in this Cup cycle is that the internal volume of the hull has to be a given amount by the class rule. And you're trying to make the boat as small as possible so it can go through the air and be as light as possible. And because there is no longer a need to have backstays, everything that's aft is no longer needed. So in a sense, what they are doing here is reducing developed area, reducing structural weight. And by saving weight, you can then have more complex systems to better trim the sails, because you have to remember that the displacement of the boats all have to be pretty much equal.
And looking below the waterline, then, what's the hull shape? Is that still echoing New Zealand's successful boat, or have they departed at all here?
There's an aspect that is similar to Team New Zealand. So all the boats are trying to close the gap between the hull and the water, and there are different ways to do this. This is what we call the bustle, and it's quite rounded in the section, similar to Team New Zealand. So on this aspect, this is quite similar to the previous generation. In the back, you can see that the shape is driven mostly by the structural needs to carry the rudder loads, whereas the new Team New Zealand boat has gone further by keeping it quite fair and smooth.
And presumably takeoff is a huge challenge for these teams, isn't it? In the wave is getting foiling, particularly in lighter winds and bigger sea state. How does that bustle help the teams do that?
Yeah, and I think it's really the key, because being in Barcelona, we expect potentially lighter air, we expect also larger waves, and how to deal with this wave is really the important aspect. So if the water is very flat, you would probably go and design a boat similar to Luna Rossa with a very long and thin bustle. But if you are not sure of the sea state, you would probably go with what is drawn on the right-hand side and what Team New Zealand and Alinghi have done, where potentially you have more of a gap against the hull, so less gains in aerodynamics, but also but also less risks that the wave will touch the boat and slow it down. You can imagine that the long extension of the bustle on the left-hand side, if the wave comes in, it will add a lot of drag, whereas on the right-hand side, you get more clearance with the water and less risk to increase hydrodynamic drag.
And then in terms of bustle shape, what clues are you getting from what we can see?
I think we can see, and it's quite interesting, that the bottom of the bustle is quite straight and horizontal. And what that means is that they are confident that they will be able to control the boat to stay level with the water, not going nose down or bow up, that they will be able to fly in a very controlled manner. You can see some other teams rounding up or sloping the back and the front.
And that makes it easier to control?
I think when the bustle is deep forward, there's always a risk that if you go nose down a little bit while you sail, that it will touch the water because you're so close to the water and you will lose speed. And so if they keep it horizontal, it means that they are feeling confident that they will manage to keep the same attitude during the flight and not risking to have additional drag.
And so how are the teams testing, or how are the teams deciding where they go with this hull shape? Obviously, there's a lot of simulator work. Is this where the LEQ boats come in?
So yeah, there's an aspect of testing the boats with the LEQ-12, and there's an aspect of simulation, but we are dealing with large unknowns, and there are aspects where science can predict performance, but here we're talking about weather conditions, which we can simulate, but to a certain degree only, and the behavior of the boat in these waves, which also has limitation. And so the reason why we see different teams approaching different philosophies is because essentially we cannot totally predict the behavior of the boat and the weather. Yeah, so essentially that's a generic 3D model of what an America's Cup boat is. And the class rules give this point, the green point, as the attachment of the forestay, and this point as the attachment of the mast. And all the geometry in between is free to be designed by the designers. But the geometry has to pass through these green points. And so looking at this 3D, I think what Alinghi is trying to do is to save weight forward of the jib and then facilitate the flow onto the jib by rounding up the edge around the perimeter of the deck and lowering the deck locally so the flow can better enter around the jib.
Obviously, this is the first F1 collaboration. You're not getting too much in the way of F1 from that.
I think we can see that it's more optimized than Team New Zealand or Luna Rossa, which have very sort of smooth lines throughout. So they have tried to optimize locally area per area and then join everything together. Now, whether Mercedes will do a more detailed and refined aerodynamics than this one, we have to see. But I find this is already an interesting design in this respect.
And that's a result of the F1 approach to aero and just their sort of whole overview way of working.
This is hard to say because it depends on how the America's Cup team is integrated with the Formula One. But we can see clearly, at least in this Cup boat, that it goes further than what the past America's Cup teams were doing in terms of aerodynamics.
So we've had a look at Alinghi Red Bull Racing, the first boat to be unveiled, but they're not the first boat to go sailing. We have seen Emirates Team New Zealand get on the water on day one, and we've also seen Luna Rossa unveiled, and we're going to look at those shortly. Of what you've seen so far, how much faster do we think these boats could be than last time around?
I think people say that the boats could reach speeds up to 55 knots, and that's quite massive. And if you think about the steps we are going through every 4 years to improve them, I think this is quite incredible. 55 knots. You have to imagine if you put your hand outside of a car driving on the motorway, and these forces you can feel in your hand. This is pretty much what these boats will go through and the crew. So yeah, it will be a lot faster.
And of what you've seen so far, is there anything that's really surprised you?
I think the Team New Zealand boat is interesting, and we will really have to look at it in more detail, maybe together, and see how it can influence the performance, especially what they have done in the back. Otherwise, generally, it is what we expect to see.
And of what we've seen of Alinghi, obviously a huge name in America's Cup circles. They know how to build a fast boat. Is this a very confident start from them in this new foiling world?
Oh yeah. I think they are really a potential contender, and they have gone into this Cup cycle knowing that they will also do the next one, and so they have signed the people over 2 Cup cycles. They have really put all the energy behind to be successful. I think you can see in how they have managed the teams and the fact that the boat is on time, that the design is refined, that it's a serious contender.
Awesome. Well, we can't wait to see it and all the others on the water. Thank you ever so much, Thomas, for your time. And hopefully we will catch up and look at some of the others really soon.
Thank you, Helen.
Thank you.
See you later.